As the war continues to deteriorate in Ukraine, as Russia continues to make advances all along the fronts, as the energy infrastructure within Ukraine continues to crumble because Russian long-range missiles are finding more and more accurate as they hit their targets, with the air defense becoming less and less capable. And as we continue with the fallout of what's happening in Moscow with the terrorist attack that happened a few days ago, with potentially significant ramifications, both for the war in Ukraine and possibly even U.S. Amidst all of that, the U.S. is actually considering, should we get more involved in Europe? Should we move more of our troops into Poland, into Romania, in a permanent stationing of our troops there? Will that help our national security, or will that keep things stirred up and keep us at more risk? We're going to look into that today. But first of all, let me give you just a brief update on what's going on with the Moscow terrorist situation there, because a lot of people have been talking about that. It continues to be at the forefront of certainly everything in Russia, like you would imagine, like ours was after 9/11. It completely consumed all of the Americans, and certainly that's the case in Russia today. Many of their politicians have been making comments. There's been lots of talks about some of the things that specifically happened, some of the survivors, lots of those stories going on. Underneath all of that, though, you keep having a lot of the Russians are asking, what next? What are we going to do about this? And who's going to be responsible? And a lot of the Russian media is reporting that right now they have actually arrested 11 additional people on top of the 4 actual assailants, the people that they say may have been accomplices inside of Russia, because obviously there's going to have to be, a lot of people. These 4 couldn't have done all this on their own. They had to have weapons. They had to have people supplying that. They had to have a path rather to where they were going to go. Someone on wherever they were heading, whether it was Ukraine or wherever else they were going, there had to be somebody on the other side to try to meet them. So Russia's trying to sort all that out. They're doing investigations right now into any, how they got the money. They're tracing all the phone calls to find out who actually was involved with this. And all these other things, that documents that they have. They're even interviewing a lot of the people who were working at the concert hall itself to see if anybody was involved with that. So all kinds of things going on there. All of this is leading, though, to a lot of anxiety within within Russia, and therefore really in Ukraine as well, as to what's going to come next, because most in the United States and Ukraine are utterly convinced that this was ISIS. Plain and simple. It was absolutely ISIS. They acted alone with no help from anyone else. That's the most convenient story, and certainly the one they're saying with a great deal of enthusiasm. If you were already for Ukraine and the West, then you also believe that for a large measure around the world. If you were Russian, almost for sure you believe that Ukraine had something to do with this. Everybody accepts that ISIS was involved because they had to release the videos on their official channels and all the things that went along with that. They don't question that part, but they do question, did they act alone? And the view in Ukraine so far is that absolutely they did, and it was Ukraine. They already believe that, and they're waiting for the investigations to prove or to validate whether it was right or not. But in any case, they are definitely expecting something big in response. In the immediate aftermath, as we put up a couple of times, Dmitry Medvedev, who's always a firebrand and a hothead and saying lots of inflammatory things, in the immediate aftermath, he said this. If you can put that on, there you go. The specific thing was, if it is established these are terrorists of the Kiev regime, it is impossible to deal with them and their ideological inspirers in any other way. All of them must be found and ruthlessly destroyed, including officials of the state that committed such an atrocity, death for death. Today, literally hours ago, shortly before we came on this event, he updated that today. And he says, everyone's asking what to do. They were caught. Well done to everyone who did it. Should they be killed? Necessary. And it will be. But it is much more important to kill everyone involved. Everyone, he emphasizes, who paid, who sympathized, who helped. Kill them all. Now, that's representing a lot of the feeling in Russia. That's getting a lot of distribution. As you can see on the bottom there, 1.9 million people viewed that as of the time that I got that screenshot there. So there is a lot of concern about how this war could possibly escalate, and what is the United States going to do about it? And we have somebody really, really good, a new guest on our show today, somebody we haven't had before. Peter Harris, associate professor at Colorado State University, a non-resident fellow at the same organization I work at, Defense Priorities. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join you.
We're certainly grateful to have you in it. And so tell us a little bit about what you do there at Colorado State.
Associate Professor of Political Science. So I teach classes mostly in international relations, international security, U.S. foreign policy. I also teach a couple of our research methods classes. So yeah, basically any student who's interested in foreign policy or security, they often end up working with me.
Very nice. And I know you've also done a lot of stuff on the China-Taiwan, which we actually tried to have you on last week, but the schedules wouldn't work it out. Probably will do that in the future. But you've also written a lot on the Russia and the Ukraine situation, which we're going to get to here shortly. But first of all, let's kind of take a look at what's been going on in the United States and how we have been moving towards this and what other things have been happening, especially relations to NATO and what they may or may not do in Ukraine. So first of all, here we have Secretary Austin at the most recent meeting in Germany, where all the 50 foreign ministers and defense ministers rather met in order to try to figure out what they can give to Ukraine. Here's what he says about our unchanging objective.
Ukraine won't back down, and neither will the United States. The United States will not let Ukraine fail. Just last week, the United States announced additional security assistance for Ukraine valued at $300 million. This is an extraordinary measure to support Ukraine's most pressing needs for air defense, artillery, and anti-tank capabilities. We were only able to support this much needed package by identifying some unanticipated contract savings.
Yeah, we'll talk about this in a second, but $300 million is a literal drop in the bucket and not going to really make any difference. But he went on from there to talk about how all of this stuff was so necessary as one of the great causes of our time.
The Czech Republic recently procured 800,000 urgently needed artillery shells. Germany, France, Denmark, and Sweden have each recently announced important new military aid packages. We will all be less secure if Putin gets his way. And we will all be less secure in a lawless, violent world where dictators can redraw borders by force, wipe countries off the map, and rebuild their old empires. So Ukraine's battle remains one of the great causes of our time. And the Ukrainian people do not have a day to waste, and neither do we.
So is he right there? Is this really one of the great causes of our time? Because, and back up a little bit, is it true that Putin wants to redraw the map and rebuild his old empire?
Well, it's a difficult question as to what really motivates Vladimir Putin and what drove him to start this war in the first place. I'll admit, I was one of these people who found it pretty unbelievable that Putin would go in full scale into Ukraine in February 2022. So I'm reluctant to make claims about exactly what drives him. I will say, and I think I agree with you on this, Danny, that even if Putin was to achieve victory in Ukraine, however that's defined, I find it very unlikely that he has plans to go further, into a NATO country, the Baltics or the Poland. That seems extremely far-fetched to me. So I think the war in Ukraine, the war aims, whatever they are for Putin, I feel pretty confident in saying they're limited to Ukraine. So the question is, who's threatened by that outside of Ukraine? Is the United States threatened by and seeing its security situation badly deteriorated with the war in Ukraine? I don't think so. I mean, I think there's a degree to which our security is interconnected with what's taking place in Ukraine, but who it really matters for is the people of Eastern Europe. So I can certainly think if Lloyd Austin was the Secretary of State for Finland or for Sweden or for Poland, his remarks would make a lot more sense, right? To have an enlarged, aggressive, emboldened Russia right on your doorstep. I could see how I would be very anxious about that as a Pole or as a Finn or as an Estonian. And I think that's where we should really see some of the action to deal with the Russian threat such as it exists.
Yeah, and trying to really double down on that, and I'm not sure who led and who followed, but that comment is also about they're coming after us, and this is the moment of our time or action of our time. You had Zelensky himself making this following claim.
there is no evil he will not commit to prolong his personal power. And there is no one in the world who is safe from this. I am grateful to every state, every leader, and all international organizations that have called and will continue to call a spade a spade. Everything Russia does in the occupied territory of Ukraine is a crime. There must be a just retribution for everything the Russian murderers have done in this war and for the sake of Putin's lifelong power. This figure must end up in the dock in The Hague. That is what we must ensure.
Now, of course, Ukraine was invaded. Their people are being killed. Their cities are being wiped off the face of the map physically and literally. And so it's totally understandable why he would be making that sound, because he wants to draw everyone else in on his side by saying, you know, this is a much bigger issue than it is, it's just for us, because you're all going to be next. And you see why he would have motivation to say that. But what should be the United States policy here, or even writ larger, NATO itself, given that there is a 32-member alliance just on the other side of the border there, where Ukraine has none when Russia came in there the first time? What should the U.S. do in terms of this? Because Zelensky specifically said we have to take him to The Hague, Putin, and all that. Well, that's certainly never going to happen. But what should happen?
Well, I think there's three things. One is NATO members need to make a decision about how far they're willing to support Ukraine in either winning its war, which I find unlikely that Ukraine is going to be able to push Russian forces outside of Ukraine entirely, but whatever victory looks like, I think it's reasonable for members of NATO to draw their own conclusions about how far their interests are served by aiding Ukraine to defeat Russia. And I think even for the United States, right, there's a reasonable case to be made that U.S. interests are served by Russia being defeated on the battlefield in Ukraine. I think certainly for the Poles, for the Germans, for the Baltic states, much more of a case for them to support Ukraine. The second thing, though, is to think about peace. One day this war will end, and the United States and its allies in NATO, as much as they want to support Ukraine in maintaining its fight, I think we know, right, the war will not end with a total victory for Ukraine. So what will peace look like? What concessions will we ask of Russia? And what concessions will we ask of Ukraine? And what concessions are we willing to make as part of a grand bargain, perhaps, to end the war in Ukraine? And at some point, we're not there yet, sadly, tragically, but we should be there, I think, in my view, thinking about what peace is going to look like. And then the third thing that NATO really needs to do is think for the long term. What will replace the failed kind of balance of power and the failed efforts of deterrence that existed before February 2022? What will replace that going forward? How will we make sure that there will not be another war between Russia and Ukraine, and there will not be another war between Russia and, God forbid, a member of NATO? And the solution there, I think, is to encourage the European members of NATO to take a lead. They need to be the ones engaging in general, direct deterrence that threatens Russia with extreme punishments if Russia were to invade a European NATO ally, not relying on the United States security guarantee, maybe for reasons we can discuss, but relying on European hard power to deter Russia from invading their soil, and doing the difficult, certainly in this context, difficult political and diplomatic spade work of conciliating Russia, having some kind of warmer peace with Russia. Deterrence didn't work, right? Deterrence didn't keep the peace on the European continent before February 2022. Yeah. So going forward, you certainly need that military deterrence piece in place, but you also need some kind of diplomatic understanding with Russia to bring them in.
Yeah, it can't just all be one. All the eggs can't be in the military basket, because that utterly failed. And yet, so far, we seem to be going on that. Now, one of the things that really concerns me is that Peter Zeihan, a well-known writer in the foreign policies field, has been making some waves, although not enough waves to me, with something he's just said recently on a British television show, when he's basically saying we need to push Russia a lot harder. Now, many people can argue that in the concept that a Russian defeat on the battlefield and driven out of Ukraine would be in the West's interest. Well, that may be fine on paper, but the problem is it would have to exist on reality, not on paper. And to drive Russia out of there would risk the possibility of a nuclear escalation dramatically higher than it is right now, even if somehow Ukraine managed to come in. Whether it was NATO troops or not, we'll talk about that specifically in just a second. But first of all, here's Peter Zeihan talking about really taking really cavalier the possibility of nuclear escalation.
One way or another, this war is either going to go into NATO countries or it's going to go into Russia proper, and a nuke is going to fly. And the best defense that we can possibly have needs to be erected before that happens. So that's kind of midterm. Shorter term, dealing with the war itself, the Russians are not going to back down at this point, even if everyone immediately stops using Russian crude. But the goal has to be at this point to make sure that the Russians have problems rearming using third countries, whether it's Iran or China or North Korea. And the best way to do that is to completely destroy the income. So we need to move into a position where we're talking about a naval blockade that simply keeps Russian oil and natural gas off the market completely.
Okay. A naval blockade is a literal act of war. So I don't know what world he could be operating in. And I truly found this puzzling that you could say nuclear weapons are going to fly at some point. So that's a given. Then to try to preempt that, let's commit an act of war and keep them from having money long term. I just don't know how he would even think that that's a possibility, because anytime you want to offer any kind of policy option or policy solution to something, it's got to be affordable, it's got to be plausible, and it's got to have a reasonable chance of success, or you need to find something else. When you have something like this that almost guarantee will result in a nuclear escalation, I don't see how that even passes one test.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree almost entirely with what was said in that clip. I mean, I think the first thing to note is I really disagree with the prediction that the war is inevitably going to go into a NATO state, or it's inevitably to be taken into Russian territory. For 2 years, the war, I mean, there have been attacks on Russian soil, but for 2 years, the war has been largely contained in Ukraine. And we haven't seen this horizontal escalation that a lot of people thought was inevitable, with the war spilling over into a NATO country. Putin exercised some restraint in terms of not attacking NATO supply lines, getting things across the border to Ukraine. And we haven't seen this vertical escalation in terms of nuclear weapons. And that's something to be, I mean, as terrible and tragic as the war is, it's something to be, to be pleased about, that at least it's been contained and we've not seen this horizontal and vertical escalation. What we do not want to do in the West is be the ones to escalate the war horizontally or vertically. And I completely agree to blockade Russian ports. And you know this, but these recommendations have been going since February and March 2022. We need to shoot down Russian planes. We need to block Russian ports. We need to give them something to worry about in Vladivostok or something like this. It's incredibly reckless talk, and comes from some people who should know a lot better. And to the credit, the Biden administration has resisted those calls quite wisely, and I'm very happy about that.
So far they have. But there's also an additional, not just an expert so-called, but also heads of state, because it made a lot of the news here recently, where Emmanuel Macron was openly talking about the possibility of sending NATO troops into Ukraine. Some of the other states, Poland, seemed to want to be messing around with that. Some of the Baltic nations were, engaging in some of this, well, who knows, kind of talk or whatever, to try to give, Russia something to think about, I think. But one of the guys we've had on our show several times, Alex from History Legend, showed a little bit about what might look like if some of the French troops did come in, especially around the port of Odessa, which has been talked about.
From an operational perspective, this task force would depart from the Romanian border. It would have to push 230 kilometers to Odessa along the M34 road through Moldova, hoping all roads are intact and that no Spetsnaz or Transnistrian troops block the path of approach. There was also a faster coastal route, but Russian missile strikes damaged the existing bridge. Then the French task force would need to advance another 50 kilometers up to the Tilihul estuary. Why? Number one, this would provide a natural water barrier to enemy columns. Number two, it would protect the E95 highway linking Odessa with the rest of the country.
Now, specifically talking about what Macron had mentioned about the possibility of French troops entering into Ukrainian territory, Vladimir Putin responded, and he was very emphatic and categorical about what he would do.
They're talking about the possibility of sending NATO military contingents to Ukraine. But we remember the fate of those who once sent their contingents to our country. But now, the consequences for possible interventionists will be much more tragic. We also have weapons. They know about this. As I just said, we also have a weapon that can hit targets on their territory. And they should understand that what they're doing now, trying to scare the whole world, it does risk a conflict with nuclear weapons, which means the destruction of civilization.
Now, you've actually warned about this in writing too. You wrote something in the first year of the war, almost exactly 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, very, very nearly so, where you were talking about American exceptionalism and the indispensable nation that many use to talk about the United States. But you were talking in there also about really NATO expansion has been a real issue as well. And it's specifically in there, you wrote that the world today is different from the 1990s. Now that rival states are more willing to punch back, it is far riskier for U.S. leaders to perform the role of indispensable nation. As President Joe Biden has cautioned, a military intervention against Russia in Ukraine could mean nothing less than World War III, which seems to be backed up by what Putin just said there. So in that event, given that this is not the same world as the 1990s, what limits or constraints should the U.S. have when it talks about what should do next? And you mentioned a second ago, and I want you to elaborate on this, that, you know, even NATO has to decide what concessions are they willing to make. And so far, nobody in the West has even broached the thought of concession. They want Russia to make all the concessions. But is that realistic?
No, it's not realistic. I mean, I think the only way that we could have a really one-sided peace settlement is for there to be a one-sided victory on the battlefield. I mean, of course, if Ukraine were to, by some miracle, expel Russian troops from its territory and there's a complete collapse of the Russian military forces, then sure, yeah, you can have peace that doesn't require any concessions by one side. Similarly, if Russia was able to conquer the whole of Ukraine, then it would be able to impose the terms of the peace. But absent that, and it looks like neither side at the moment has a realistic prospect of achieving total victory on the battlefield, both sides need to bring concessions to the table. I mean, from the early on in the war, it's looked likely that Ukraine would have to tacitly, if not kind of legally, accept some loss of territory that's been taken by Russia, and then there'll be conversations over its place in the European security order. Will it be a member of NATO, or a member of the European Union, or will the door be shut on those things? These kind of security guarantees, so-called guarantees by certain European member states, really is kind of guaranteeing arms sales and economic assistance in the event of a future war with Russia. What's their status in a future European security order? All of that would have to be discussed. And I think it's reasonable to ask some concessions from Russia. I think Russia could do some stuff in Belarus to make Poland and the Baltics feel more secure, maybe pull back its nuclear forces, maybe even reduce its conventional forces in Belarus. But the West will probably have to make some kind of concessions too on behalf of Ukraine. And people balk at that, right? They don't like the idea of making concessions on behalf of Ukraine to establish peace in Europe. But it's not that much different from sending money and sending arms and aid in Ukraine. If we're willing to take these steps to aid Ukraine, we're willing to pay a cost to aid Ukraine, and we're willing to risk, as the French are saying, risk escalation and military escalation involved. Why not? We're already accepting some kind of cost and risk there. Concessions is just a different type of cost, right? Thankfully, it's not a cost in people's lives, but it's a cost. And if we're willing to aid Ukraine, I think it kind of logically follows we should be willing to also make concessions on Ukraine's behalf.
And so one wonders if, I mean, I would like to hope, I don't know that I'm confident enough to say I think they are, but it would be great if what the U.S. is talking about right now in terms of expanding our involvement in NATO, not cutting it back, not handing it off to to Europeans to do more for their own security, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. But there is a report out from CSIS that's been reported in a number of media outlets that the U.S. is considering putting a permanent armor brigade into Poland and to sending more troops into Romania. Gary, if you could bring that headline up there so we can see the one we're talking about. It's been something we've been talking about for a while. Actually, not that one. This is the one. Not that one either. Sorry, it's the headline. That's the one. Yeah. The Stars and Stripes recently reported the U.S. force posture in Poland, Romania ought to be strengthened. Now, one wonders if perhaps the U.S. could use that as a bargaining chip. You mentioned that maybe Russia would have to demilitarize some in Belarus. Perhaps that could be something they could do. It would not seem to be conducive to reaching an agreement if we're increasing our military presence closer to the Russian border at the same time. What do you make of that play?
Yeah, I think if it's part of a bargaining strategy, something to be given up in future negotiations, that's fine. If this is a long-term strategy for maintaining peace in Europe, I think it's flawed. So you have to think, if you're Vladimir Putin, what prevents you from starting a general war in Europe? One thing that might stop you is you just don't want to. It's just not something that particularly appeals to you. The second thing is, if you did want to kind of start a general European war, you wouldn't if you faced the prospect of retaliation. So massive, severe retaliation from a well-armed adversary. The Europeans are the best placed to make those credible threats against Putin. They've got the money, they've got the resources to invest in a very strong conventional military, and they've got the credibility to promise to defend themselves in wars of national self-defense. The United States will always suffer from an inherent credibility problem when it comes to promising extended deterrence, that we will fight World War III on behalf of allies in Eastern Europe. We may do that, but if I'm Vladimir Putin, I always have doubt as to whether, no matter how many troops you put there, I doubt whether you would follow through and fight what Joe Biden called World War III that could turn nuclear against me. I'm much more likely, and this is, I think Europeans are not used to thinking this way. They think they're much safer behind a US security umbrella. I think that's got it wrong. They're much safer behind a credible deterrent that they make themselves to defend themselves. That's what Putin would believe. And that's what can deter him from any kind of adventurism in Eastern Europe that he might be, or some future Russian leader might be tempted to pursue in the future.
So there was an explainer published on defense priorities not long ago by Rajan Menon, who we've had on our show here, where he's talking about that we need to reconfigure NATO and the case for burden shifting. Now, this almost seems counterintuitive a little bit. We're going to talk about some of those specific points in a second. But first of all, I'd just like to ask you, in the theoretical concept, everybody in the U.S., and you can go all the way back to those 1990s that you referred to in your earlier piece there, American leadership. We have to lead the way. So America has to be out front, and we can't be back, or else then we're leading from the rear, so to speak. What do you say to those people who argue that to rebalance and to put Europe up front and put the America like over the shoulder is the right thing to do?
I think there's three historical time periods we should think about. One was the early Cold War, when I think it did make a lot of sense for the United States to be forward deployed in Europe as a way to deter the Soviet Union. At that point in time, Western Europeans could not defend themselves and they could not deter the Soviet Union. And there was a strong economic and national security case for the United States preventing a war in Europe, and ergo it followed that the United States needed to be the one to pick up that slack. Then you have this other period in the kind of the 1990s where the United States could be the security provider in Europe. It probably shouldn't have, to be honest, in the 90s and early 2000s, but it could, and it wasn't very risky because no one really thought that Russia was going to start a war in Eastern Europe. So the threat to intervene, or the promise to intervene on Europeans' behalf, was probably less credible, but it didn't really matter that much. Now we're in this third, more dangerous period where the risk of war is higher. And in fact, we do have, the first major land war in Europe since 1945. But we've got this incredible commitment, or at least questionably credible commitment, that will race to the defense of our European allies. And I think that's bad for the United States to make that promise, right? Because we don't want to be dragged into World War III. And if push came to shove, we may choose to not fight World War III. And it's better for the Europeans to rely on a power that is, in North America rather than Europe. It's actually in their interest to take more of the lead, and for the United States to recede into the background. Sure, some kind of arsenal of democracy type role, economic assistance type role, but it's much more in the European self-interest to be self-reliant, to have these unilateral deterrents that they can use themselves to keep them safe. It's not about abandoning allies. It's about coming up with the correct deterrent and the correct deterrence regime in Europe. And I think we can best support our allies by encouraging them to be resilient against Russian aggression.
Yeah. Now, one of the things specifically that Rajan mentioned in there was, he said, Russia's attack on Ukraine has revealed the weakness of the Russian military, which makes burden shifting even more appropriate. Now, you had talked earlier that this is not 1990, that Russia does have some capability now, but as we discussed earlier in this show, they don't have the capacity to replicate the Soviet Union and roll all the way across to the Western Europe. They just don't have the capacity to do so, and nor the desire, from anything I can see as well. So given that reality, and that Russia definitely has shown their conventional weakness by the fact that more than 2 years of full-on war, they still only have about 17-18% of the Ukrainian territory, and who knows how much further they may go, but it's certainly not going to be much further than that. Definitely not going to be anywhere into the NATO countries here. So given that reality, it would seem to make sense militarily for the the NATO European states to step up and take more of the leadership role and the priority, and for the United States to say, hey, we still are your allies, but we're now the over the shoulder. We're the second. We're not the first line of defense. We're the backups here, because you're the ones that are on the front lines. It seems that it would even be in the Europeans' desire to do that for their own security. So, as you say, they don't have to rely on wondering if the U.S. Congress would back an Article 5 requirement. I
think so. And, I'm from Europe. I'm originally from the UK. I'm a US citizen now, but when I think from a European perspective, who would have, and I said this earlier in the show, but who would have really suffered and whose security would have been really jeopardized if Russia would have taken Kyiv in 3 weeks? If Russia had kind of gobbled up Ukraine and kind of annexed all that territory, whose security would have been badly jeopardized by that? And it's Europe, right? It's the neighbors. It's Poland, it's Romania, it's the Baltics, it's Germany. And so it's those countries that, as you say, are on the cold face, whose security is truly imperiled by what's taking place in Eastern Europe right now, should be taking the most vigorous steps to deter future Russian aggression. And the Baltic states they're doing some of this, right? So they're fortifying their borders with Russia. The Poles have done a good job of bolstering their defense spending. The Germans less so, and other European states less so too. But it makes a lot more sense to me for states that are close to the coalface, whose security is truly jeopardized by the current war, by a future potential war, to organize now, to network now, to pool resources now, and to level credible threats against Russian leaders that, should you initiate a new war or escalate horizontally the present war, you will be met by fierce resistance by us. And we don't need the United States, right? You may question America's investment in Eastern Europe and its credibility. You could point to what's taking place in the U.S. Congress to fund Ukraine, and you in Russia, in Moscow, may doubt America's credibility. It doesn't matter, because we're here and we're well armed, and we are credibly threatening to punish you as Europeans on European soil. That's the strongest deterrent, right? Not kind of pegging this or hitching this to what, as you say, the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress will agree to, but what Europeans will do. That's the most credible deterrent.
It is, and there's been lots of, we're now getting into the presidential election. We're getting closer to the general now. And so a lot of people are talking about, what the next president's going to do, especially as it turns to NATO. A lot of talk about that lately, about Donald Trump, because a lot are afraid, oh, he's going to get rid of NATO. He's going to quit doing it. He's made these outlandish claims about he wouldn't protect somebody if they didn't pay their dues or whatever. But there is some truth behind what he's saying, that the Europeans should step up, because, as you pointed out a couple of times now, this isn't 1990. And this isn't 1949 either, where the Europeans are capable. They do have the economic wherewithal. They do have the capacity to provide more for their own security, not just at a percentage of GDP, but in a capability, in something that will provide a legitimate conventional deterrent against any kind of Russian incursion, which seems unlikely, but they can do that. And we already have a nuclear deterrent that would prohibit Russia from initiating any kind of a nuclear attack because of the certainty of the response. So that part is also it's still in place and continue to be so. Given those realities, that it is appropriate for the U.S. to reduce what it does over there for our own security, for our own economics, and it is appropriate for Europe to step up and do more for their own defense. And I certainly hope that's the way it goes, regardless of who wins here in the United States this November.
I couldn't agree more. And, as a European, it feels like it's deja vu all over again. Didn't we have these same conversations about Trump and America's commitment to Europe 4 years ago? I mean, I remember Angela Merkel saying the era of relying upon the United States for our security is over, and the era of Europeans having to do more to provide for our own common defense is here and now. And that was 4 years ago. Yeah. And I feel like when Joe Biden was sworn in, they kind of forgot all that, and now they're quickly remembering it. It looks possible that Trump could be president again. It's really frustrating to watch, but the world has changed. America has changed. Agree with him or disagree with him, somebody like Trump could be president in perpetuity, right? There's no guarantee that we're ever going to return to a period in American history where both parties were reliably committed to the defense of Western Europe or Eastern Europe. And the Europeans need to get used to that. I think they hope that the deployment of American troops on European soil will serve as tripwires, right? That they'll be caught up in the kind of the mass of a general European war, and America would have to commit and mobilize. But recent political science literature suggests that tripwires might not work quite as effectively as people hope. Right. And what really matters is a president's or a leader's assessment of what is my core national interest. And I just can't believe, or at least I'm skeptical, that a sitting US president would judge it's in America's national interest to risk a nuclear war with Russia over the fate of Estonia.
And here's what not many people, even in America, realize, that this Article 5 does not automatically trigger the United States into a war. It must go through the Congress, even more than just the president, that they have to agree and vote on entering a war. And I think the chances of getting enough members of Congress to go on the record and say, yes, let's plunge into a war that could go nuclear almost immediately is pretty low. So given that reality, I think that the Europeans would be much smarter and much more secure to be relying on their own defense capabilities. I mean, that's what I would think, aside from what anybody in the U.S. wants.
No, I completely agree. And again, the framing of this in the U.S. is sometimes frustrating. It's about kind of abandoning NATO or being there for our allies. And I think it's the wrong framing. The real issue is, what's the best way to preserve peace and the status quo, and what's the best way to deter future aggression? And if that is not the United States offering a security guarantee, then so be it. And I think it is not. I think there should be British bases. I think there should be French bases. I think there should be German bases in the Baltics and in Poland. I mean, to the credit, the Brits do have, I think it's about 16,000 troops right now in the East. The Germans need to do more. The French need to do more. And they all need to spend a hell of a lot more. And as I think we agree on this, that the point is not that the United States is doing something wrong by shifting the burden to Europeans. It's just the right thing for European security.
Realities that exist, and the balances of power, I think it is. Well, listen, Peter, I'm so grateful to having you come on the show today. We look forward to having you back on at some point in the future, but you've made some great points today that I hope our audience will listen, and I really hope that those in Europe will actually pay attention to as well, because that ultimately they can benefit. Thanks for coming on today.
I appreciate that. If I could just say one last thing, it's a shame that my 7-year-old couldn't be here, because I remember one time we were in a conference call together, and he said, "Hey, George Washington is making some great points." He thought you were George Washington. So there you go. Thanks for having me on the show.
I appreciate that. and we appreciate you guys for watching today as well. We remain unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truths, even if it's not pleasant and somebody might not want to hear it. It's the right thing, and it will ultimately benefit the United States. Folks, we got some great shows coming up for you tomorrow you won't want to miss. We have John Mearsheimer and Matthew Ho on tomorrow, two of our all-time faves. You're not going to want to miss those. Tune in tomorrow. Like and subscribe to this and share it with your friends. Let them know to tune in tomorrow, and we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.